So firstly, thanks for the opportunity to speak this morning. Some of my notes that I was taking at the back, where I was actually noting down some of the things that were coming from the tables, because what I've realised is that my last 40 years I could have just come here this morning and I would have picked up a lot of the information, a lot of the insights that I'm actually going to talk about a bit this morning. So I'm going to talk firstly about leadership, my leadership journey, which starts to sound a bit like a eulogy, I know, but I'm hoping that by talking through my sort of pathway to where I've got to as a principal at Brighton Secondary School, if nothing else, it'll give you hope in your careers, because it's been an interesting sort of journey for me. And then I'll talk about some observations around leadership. And as I said, many of those things around leading innovation and change are things that, many things I'll talk about are things that have been discussed from your table summaries this morning. So the first thing I suppose is that anything we say about leadership isn't formulaic. I know everywhere we look there's 5 guides to being this and six steps to leading change and eight necessary stages to being a great leader and all those sort of things. But I think while it's not formulaic, there are some underlying principles that are useful to think about. And so I'll get onto that in a moment, but I will just quickly add a bit to what Peter talked about from what seems like, and is a long, long time ago in Whyalla, looking back across how I came to be in a principal position now. And when you look back, as I'm sure you do in your lives, there seems to be some sort of connection and flow, but it's not really a sequential journey for many people, I don't think. There's some intentional aspects certainly, but many accidental and incidental elements, and certainly in my journey there's been lots of roadworks, go-slow zones and cul-de-sacs. So I think starting off, and I know working with Peter as part of a really vibrant faculty in Whyalla, and we're talking about some of the experiences we had this morning, reminiscing as people always do about those things. I was really fortunate to work in a faculty that was a really reflective and professional group of people, and from that worked quite a bit with the English Teachers Association, and then through that with work required assessment, worked in the Senior Secondary Curriculum Project, and eventually worked at SASPA and got my first DP role really through the work that we'd started as beginning teachers in Whyalla. So I think one of the things is, and I'm sure many of you are the same, that you had a sort of restlessness about teaching. I think Peter and I worked opposite each other, and I was always really impressed with Peter's, the way Peter engaged the kids in a range of ways in his English class. But we also looked at opportunities beyond what we were doing. I always say to teachers at school that I think the most difficult transition to make is from a 5-line teacher into a B1 role, because you're so tied up with 5 lines of teaching, which is a massive job, trying to find opportunities to extend and to develop the sort of skills and experiences that you might be able to apply to a B1 position, for example, in applying for one is really critical. And so I think I'd urge you in your roles, whatever level they are, to think about that and to think about the 5-line teacher and how you might be able to support them in that first transition, because I think that's a critical transition into leadership, that first step. So I made that transition in an unfamiliar way in a sense, because I never worked as a B1 or as a coordinator, as it was in those days, as a learning area leader. I actually moved across and worked through a curriculum project, as it was in those days, and then ended up working at the SASPA board, the equivalent then. And from there went to the parks as deputy and actually worked with Jean, who's here, and many other wonderful people at the parks. It doesn't exist anymore, but it was a really challenging school, but the most supportive school I ever worked in, I think. That was my first deputy job of 5. So I was deputy in 5 schools. So I was kept working on it until I was getting it right. But I mean, that's not altogether general either, I don't think, to work in that many schools. But in each school, there was a real opportunity to learn. And so in that one, I was the senior school and SACE person, daily organisation. So in those days, doing the release by hand, getting into school at 6:30, waiting, hoping you didn't get phone calls, trying to respond, trying to get on the phone to get people. I mean, those sort of, I think I really came to understand some of the fabric of not only how schools worked at an organisational level at that point, but also some of the things that were happening in the lives of staff And I think that gave a real insight into that. There's real disadvantage, complexity, but there's real agility and responsiveness and collegiality and culture in that school that was really instructive for me. In the second term I was there, I was acting principal, so I was a new deputy, and then I was acting principal for a term, during which time it was announced that the school would be closing. So there's a fair bit of stuff to deal with there. So I think another thing is about deep end. I mean, sometimes you don't choose it, but sometimes there's a deep end experience, and you certainly learn a lot from that and build some sort of sense of efficacy. So following that, for a range of reasons, after school closed, I was a DP in 5 different schools. And that was great learning because you get to learn alongside, and in my case, some of these weren't of my choosing, to work alongside different people and to really see different styles of leadership and different intent. So some of it was accidental and coincidental. There was a phone call I made to a friend to see how they were getting on, and they had a contact with someone in another school, and that's how I ended up at Seton High School for 5 years. Mate did a principal job there for 6 months, and I decided then that I really did want to be a principal. And so I really focused on the process as it was then, which is a bit different now, but not hugely different. And I got to the stage 1 week where I had 3 interviews for principal positions. And I thought, well, surely, I've had 3 interviews in a week, which is pretty challenging to start with. Surely one of them's got to come through. Well, no, they didn't. And in fact, I was told, as you're always told by education directors in those days, that you were close but not quite there in 2 of them. The other one, however, there was no appointment made. So in that one, they chose no one over me, which was a bit challenging. And I actually did, I admit, go into some sort of professional fetal position for a few years. And I think at the time, what I didn't do probably was reflect on what the issues were, and I always stress to people, it's really good to get feedback and to really genuinely think about what it is that you're perhaps not bringing. What I did instead, once again, kind of accidentally, was to fall into what's similar now to a principal consultant role. In those days, there were district directors, and so I worked with someone there in a region, and I acted as district director twice when they had extended leave for term and so on. So I hadn't actually been a principal at this stage on a substantive level, but I was working in that regional role. And I think one of the real advantages of that was that I worked closely with primary schools and preschools, and I learned a lot about those sectors, and also with support services, which in those days were aligned to the regional services. So I worked with speech paths and psychologists and so on. And I really came to understand the value that's in those sort of roles, that often in schools I think we sort of see these people and increasingly we don't see much of them, but to really understand just the value of that. So one of the flow-on effects of that is that when I was at Warianda and more recently at Brighton, we've actually employed a speech path to work in our school, because we really see the value of what they bring in terms of not just working with students, but really providing professional learning for teachers in terms of how they work with kids. So I think those sort of things, sometimes it's the incidental things that you sort of learn from that can really enhance and enrich your leadership. During that time also, I went off and did some other things, and even though Peter was mentioning my perhaps lack of commitment in some ways in football and Whyalla, I did actually go on to coach at a regional level. And one of the things, and not being in the role I was in, not that those roles aren't challenging, but it did allow me some space to do some other things. And during that, I really developed some skills, I think, that became valuable later on. And certainly in terms of, we talk about shared purpose and culture and high expectations and feedback and difficult conversations and data. At that time, the football club I was involved in, SANFL level, actually had a much clearer process and much more deliberate use of data than the schools I was working in, because it was a very clear thing about improvement. So at half time, we'd have data sets would go up. You might think it's all sort of grunting and different things in a football club, but in fact, there were key indicators that went up on the whiteboard at half time, and we talked about, these are the data sets, we're not hitting this, we're not hitting, and so it really reinforced for me, and in some ways enhanced, I think, my capacity to think about using data for improvement. So I suppose in that, it's looking for opportunities in different kinds of areas to enhance what we do. there was reorganisation, and I went back to a school as the DP. And once again, I had a clear plan. It was intentional because the school I was going back to, the principal had moved on. There was someone in there for 12 months. That person was retiring, and here was the position for me. Well, again, unsuccessful. And but this time, I actually did go and seek some really strong feedback. And at the time, I was looking at some other positions as well. And in this case, it became the position we're in became available for a year. And of course, in keeping with fairy tales, there's a happy ending. I won that position, and it was fantastic because I think that goes to show that not all roadblocks are bad. Like at that point, that one clearly wasn't available, and that's why I'd sort of banked on for some time. But the irony was that I ended up at Wirianda, which was actually one of the 3 interviews I'd had 7 years earlier, and hadn't won the position at that point. And at the time, I sort of reflected on what kind of leader I would have been if I'd gone there 7 years earlier, and the kind of leader I was able to be by the time I got there. Not right or wrong, just different, I think. During the time at Wirianda, hopefully my Wirianda colleagues here, a few years on, will agree that there was significant change, innovation, improvement, and since then, hopefully, partly because of the work that we did then, there's been some outstanding work done since in an environment that was really ready to change and to develop. So, again, it was a sort of a circuitous route to where I got, but through that, it provided great opportunities. But great opportunities in particular for working with and through the leadership of others. And so the programs and the sort of innovations that we did there was so much about, and a key part of leadership, is getting the right people and working with people in order for them to be able to do the things that need to be done. Develop that shared sense of purpose that I know a number of the table groups talked about, and have a really clear underlying narrative so that teachers, non-teaching staff, students, families, and the community sort of understand what's happening. Because often I think we do really great work, but we don't sort of let people know how they can connect into it and how they might. So that whole sense of, as a phrase about who we are and who we want to be, that sense of who are we now, where are we now, where do we want to be, and how might we get there. So, thanks, Pete. So after 6 years at Wirianda, I was actually minding my business looking for a student who had done something wrong, and I had a phone call offering me opportunity to come in for 6 weeks and work in the Review, Improvement and Accountability Directorate, which had just been set up to set up the external school reviews. Ended up going in there for 4 years. And once again, I was really out of my comfort zone because we're developing and implementing school review processes, which can be quite controversial. Some of the previous models hadn't been all that well received. It included a process of identifying schools for 1 year return, so it meant that some schools are being identified as needing to have significant improvement, and there was challenges, of course, in working across those sort of roles. We developed the SR process and framework, the annual report process, and the school improvement planning cycle that's come up now. So I'm really proud of the work that we did during that time, and that continues to be done in there. But it was interesting because some of my colleagues in schools referred a number of times to me having gone to the dark side and going into the system, going to central office. And I think this is one of the things we really need to challenge and to really see that sense of systemness is a really important part of public education, that the sense of them and us just isn't productive at all, and that, as I've tried to explain, some of the insights that you can get from opportunities to work in different areas within the department can really enhance your leadership, and really do need to see ourselves as all working within the system for the benefit of public education and for our students. So I would really emphasise that value of out-of-school experience and perspective. So after 4 years in that role, the opportunity came to, the principal position came up at Brighton Secondary School, and it was a really big decision to make because the work was continuing in the department, but my passion has always been in schools and in school leadership. So back, I went to a very large and main school, about 1,700 students, 120 teaching staff and about 30 non-teaching staff. Of course, then we had COVID, which has been a challenge for all of us this year. There's Year 7 to high school work, which I think provides a huge opportunity, as people were talking about before, for reflection and regeneration, for thinking about not only how middle schooling can be, and in our case, establishing a middle schooling structure which hasn't really been there before, but also to think about how it can inform other aspects of our work throughout the school. I'll talk in a minute about the structures that we've talked about, but it's also provided an entree into implications for pedagogy and for student connectedness that have been really significant for us. The other thing that was kind of interesting was, having led out some of the work around school improvement planning, it was then a matter of going to a school and trying to make it happen, which is, you know, that challenge of moving from the theoretical model to the actual process in a school, which has been really challenging, but also really exciting. So what it's provided us the opportunity to do is to really reshape and reevaluate what Brighton Secondary School's focus is, what our core purpose is, and we've gone to, and we had a process really of reflecting on the school improvement plan as it existed. I'll talk in a minute about this tension between change and stability. But what we did was really what I did with other people was to really go in and talk about, is this, because as you know, the school improvement planning stuff happened pretty quickly at the end of 2018, and schools had plans in place. But in 2019, when I arrived in the middle of the year, for that second half of the year, it was a great opportunity to really think about, does that really capture what we want to do as a school? Does that really capture and provide a focus for our work the way we want it to? And during that time, I've worked with senior leaders, and then with the leaders group, and then with learning areas, and then with the whole staff. And we reshaped the school improvement plan quite a bit. And as I think was said earlier in a number of the groups, that's got to happen alongside and with people, so they feel it's not just being done to them. And that can be a challenge in a school of 120 teachers in this case, and also when there have been particular structures and processes in place. So we moved to a system where we changed really two of the goals. One, the first one was about stretch and challenge for all students, and that was quite deliberate around trying to make a much more inclusive sort of approach to our school. And the other one was around improving students' connectedness and engagement in the classroom and the school community, because once again, our data showed that our students didn't necessarily feel particularly connected or belonging to the school. So those were some of the things that we really focused on in the first, that we focused on really in the first 12 months at the school. So a few reflections, and as I said, these things really do parallel a lot of the feedback that came from the tables in your work this morning. The first thing is that as a leader, it's not about you. It's about focusing on students and their wellbeing and learning, and it's about the people you lead. So I always say change happens in the classroom, not in the principal's office. And you can really only lead innovation and change through influencing what's happening in the classroom and teacher practice. And I think increasingly we understand the importance of middle level leaders, and particularly in a large school where you just can't have the sort of influence in a direct level that you can in perhaps a smaller primary school. You really need to invest in people and build strong teams and support people to become the best leaders they can be. And as a leader, your greatest power is really through other people, certainly rather than over people, which is probably the earlier paradigm around the principal and the leader role. You really do need to get staff on board, which sounds easy, but of course, as we know, isn't. So I think really leadership needs to happen from the front, the middle and the back. So, and all those parts are critical and interconnected. You need to work at all of those levels. And I think when I say leadership, I mean that both from, whether it's from the principal, from deputies and APs, or whether it's from a learning area leader or a B1 role, it's really about building capacity of the people you work with. So leadership from the front is really about having a really clear direction and a compelling vision, a narrative that people can see themselves as part of. That thing is the leader is a storyteller, the leader of being able to give people a story that they can buy into and they can see themselves in moving forward. Defining expectations really clearly and always basing what you're talking about on a clear sense of purpose and trying to get that collective buy-in. So that's the sort of big picture stuff. The leadership from the middle, I think, is really around being part of the group and embodiment of the shared group values. Like, you really need to represent the sort of values that you are trying to engender in terms of expectations and so on, and also in terms of modelling the learning together, modelling the vulnerability, those sort of things, which can be challenging, as we say it is for teachers. And I think the deprivatisation of practice for leaders is also a really challenging thing. But it's something that we need to do, both in terms of having an influence and power within the group rather than over the group. And then the other thing is around leadership from the back or from the background. And often our best work isn't visible, I think. It's around coaching, supporting and mentoring and enabling and acknowledging other people's work and leading through others in terms of building capability and reinforcing belief. I know the work that was done at Wirianda, which I can talk about over that longer period of time, I look at each one of those, key things. Like, we had a WAVE program, a flow program. That's a fantastic program run by Paul Sherman, who's an outstanding leader. The learning hub that we developed, the Learner Wellbeing Centre, the Disability Unit, all those things were, in terms of leadership, I look back and I'm really proud about those things. But my part of that was so much about supporting the people who actually led those things out, and I think that's really where the power comes from the leadership. And increasingly also through student agency, voice and leadership, which was also mentioned this morning. I think increasingly we're realising how important that student agency is. And I know at Brighton, one of the biggest levers we've got for improvement and change is with our student cohort. The other thing about that, I think, is that when you have people who are responsible for areas, they need to be supported, but they also need to have responsibility and authority. I really try not to micromanage. I think in terms of having a leadership culture and a learning culture, it's really important that people have an opportunity to lead out with support, with scaffolding, but also then to be able to, at times, things not go right. And certainly I've had lots of experience of that in my own leadership. Working from a clear moral purpose and set of values. As we said earlier, I think that's a really fundamental part, so that everything that we do is underpinned by that reference point in your leadership. When difficult times come, being able to have a clear reference point for why things are happening the way they are is really critical. It needs to be collaborative and relational. As we said before, once again, it's an easy thing to say, but having that shared sense of vision, building a collective purpose, and as I said, framing that around who we are and who we want to be, having that clear sense of where we are and where we want to be moving together. It also needs to be really strategic, and I think there's a bit of a dichotomy people express sometimes about management and leadership, and we're all very careful these days, as we have been actually in our model, to talk about leadership, not management. But I don't see it as a dichotomy, but rather as a synergy. So it's really interconnected and interdependent. It's a bit like having a nice car, and you sort of, what you experience might be, and I know nothing about how the car runs, but the car needs to run really well as well. And so those two parts of the actual mechanics of it and the appearance and how things operate are really interconnected. So that alignment of resources with school priorities, making sure the budget, professional learning aligns with the SIP priorities, the leadership structure, which I'll share with you in a minute, how that aligns, and making sure that the decisions and actions are informed by data, evidence and research. So innovation is a means, not an end. Like, the end game is improvement. So any innovation we want to put in place is really only of value if it leads to improvement in terms of student learning. So one of the things we've done this year is to develop a new leadership structure, and it's part of the reason for the 22 panels is that there's a few new positions there, but it's also just there happen to be quite a few tenures finishing this year as well. So what we've done is the school, which will be 1,800 when we have it'll be 1,900 initially and then 1,800 once we settle into 6 years, 6-year levels of 300 each. We've gone to a middle school and senior school model, and you can see there we've got year level leaders and also an engagement and learning person. I won't go into student services in any great detail now, but I think there's a whole lot of, as I said before, opportunities for involvement of other professional services in terms of student services in particular, and we'll be looking at that. And so each one of those is really about line leadership in terms of the head of middle school, head of senior school, and then the structure and organisation person, once again, that role is often seen as a management role, and I suppose there's lots of organisational parts to it, but it's also got to be the driver and the enabler for the innovation that you want to have in place. So that's a really critical part of the innovation as well. Evidence-informed practice is really about, I think we talk a lot about all the data we've got available and what everything needs to be evidence-based, but I think there's a big gap between us saying that and actually delivering that in the classroom so that teachers have really clear data that's available in a usable form that they can then understand how they apply that into their practice, and that operates through each level of the school. So in terms of making strategic decisions at a whole school level or at a cohort level, we're really keen to have someone who's focusing specifically on that. We did a lot more analysis of our SASE data this year, really in-depth analysis of our SASE data, and we want to be looking at how we can use data a lot more strategically within the school. So that's that role. The school climate role, once again, inclusive education. SC is student connectedness. We've had a big focus on that this year. We created a teacher role this year with a line release to increase the opportunity for student engagement within the classroom and in the school generally. And so we've had students presenting at staff training and development days and so on. And so we see that as a really critical part going forward. We have a special interest volleyball program, AETs at middle and senior school, and a Recito, and we're a music school. But one of the things about that is that there's those clear vertical roles in terms of line leadership and having teams that operate really strongly vertically, but it's also really critical horizontally. And it's a bit like when we talk about buildings, we've got a new $13.8 million building coming for our middle school, but you can have a building that's as nice as possible with great learning environment that's all, educationally correct. But unless you have the right sort of operation within it, the right kind of pedagogy, that's not going to make any difference for student learning outcomes. In the same way, leadership structure doesn't guarantee anything unless this structure is really interconnected, and both in terms of teams. I'm a really strong believer in teams operating strongly both vertically and horizontally. And through that, it's there that the shared vision of purpose and collaboration really comes through. And Jay mentioned before, I think about the how, about the way we work is really critical. So the kinds of people we want in those leadership positions are people who are not only experts in their area and who are able to lead teams vertically, but who are also able to and focused on working horizontally and across the system with people as well. The thing about innovation and change is that things can't change and stay the same. So one of the tensions that we've been discussing at school is, what is it, particularly in a school that's got a really strong tradition and structure around it, you've got to be a bit careful because in order to improve, things need to change, but not everything can change, and certainly not at once. So that tension between disruption and stability, and where are the strategic levers that you can use around things like leadership or curriculum shape or pressure points around pedagogy and resourcing. Those are sort of levers that you have available to you, but needing to do that in a really strategic way. I was thinking about a Jenga analogy, where as things go, you've got to be thinking all the time, is there enough solidity in the structure for us to make this change, to pull this out or to add something in? And so that's something that I think we really need to be constantly focused on. The other thing is that looking for connections and leverage all the time. So when I came and heard Martin Westphal speak recently, the work that Martin's doing was a clear leverage point for us in terms of the school, in terms of our journey, and thinking about how that really underpins a lot of the same work that we're trying to do. So I think hopefully it's touched on a few observations really about leadership. but in particular, I think the key thing is that it's just a fantastic opportunity to lead, and I think it's a joy and a privilege. And I'm really excited that to look around and see the next group of aspiring principals coming through. And what I'd say is that there are certainly challenges, but there's also huge rewards. So thank you for your attention, and good luck with your future work. Thank you.
Thank you to you, Tony, for coming in today and sharing with us. So you had to extract yourself from those many panels, but it really was great to have you here. Just missed you at where you ended, but it genuinely was really wonderful to hear your leadership narrative and really explore that essence of reflective practice and that culture of improvement that you've carried with you. So thank you.
We do have some time for questions if people would like to ask Tony some questions. We have morning tea obviously coming up. If you're going to ask a question, and I seriously encourage you to do so, you are going to have to use your best teacher voice. Okay, Jackie.
I have a few. Sorry. Don't worry there. I was just wondering why science role was the B2 as opposed to all the other B1s.
Right, the answer is that's an earlier draft, it's a B1. It was previously a B2 because the school had developed a STEM Bright program, so the school has a number of strands, Think Bright, Company Bright, STEM Bright, that have been special entry programs, and so STEM Bright was one of them, but that's not continuing, so that's good pickup, and yeah, that's a ask for the most recent one, but it's now been advertised as B1.
Actually, I have one more. Can you give an example of the strategic levers you mentioned when we were talking about tension between innovation and structure?
Well, I guess one is the leadership structure. So thinking about how you use your resources strategically. So creating positions to do certain things. So, for example, the student connectedness role this year. So as far as the work that we did around reshaping our school improvement plan, one of the things that came up was a problem through the evidence of students feeling connected or not connected with the school. So this year we talked about creating, and we did create a teacher position, one line release, to work on that. That's been highly successful, and so now we're now going to fund that in terms of a B1 position for the next 3 years. So I think that's one example of saying, what are the things that we really value, and making sure that the things that we want to see are the things that we're funding. So that's one example, I think.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm just wondering, are your year level managers wellbeing leaders as well? I noticed there wasn't a wellbeing focus at all in what we could see.
Yeah. So we've had a model of having wellbeing teacher leaders. So those people are released, they only teach one line, they're released for 4 lines. They're at teacher level, so they're not B1s. And this year we put in one B1 leader to lead that out. But as I was saying before, I think in terms of student services, what we're looking at, and actually for the next few months we're going to have an opportunity, and this afternoon I'm meeting with a principal from another school because I heard about their structure of using youth workers and a model of different sort of services with psychology services and so on. And so we're really looking at that at the moment. And so the year level, what we've had is year level managers who have had release time but not leadership position, and we've had the wellbeing teacher leaders. So what we're doing is creating the year level leaders at each level at B1, and then the learning and engagement person in the middle school and the learning and engagement person in the senior school. But their roles are more around proactive programs in terms of learning and engagement. And there'll be some overlap about wellbeing. I think we're in a funny place with some of the terminology around some of this, and talking about well-being and well-being for learning and engagement, it's all being a bit conflated. So we're certainly looking at a model that will involve the use of some other services, like, for example, youth workers, and certainly we have a psychologist that comes in but isn't part of our school. We just provide a space for them, whereas we think there's some opportunities for for leveraging some of that expertise and quite specific professional expertise more than we are at the moment, in the same way as we do with increasingly with the speech path. It's been sabotaged a bit by COVID, not being able to run the sort of professional training that we've wanted to do with that. But with that role, in a similar way, we want that person to provide direct services to students, but as importantly, to provide professional learning for staff, teachers in particular, about how they can work with students in those ways, whether it's around literacy and language with speech path, or whether it's around well-being and mental
I
health.
guess it's just like the site that I'm at is a Category 1 site, so it's a bit more problematic in that, and we use all of those things that you've just mentioned, but we also have full-time wellbeing leaders for that on-call sort of stuff for constant
Yeah.
students.
Yep.
I guess the other question is, what is the percentage of students at your school with we wouldn't sponsor with additional needs or learning difficulties? Because I don't know within that model if there was like a disability coordinator.
Oh yeah, there's an increase.
Like where the OCOPs fall and things like that. So
Yep.
like, what is the percentage? Do you know?
Yeah, I don't know. It's about 7%, which is
Sorry.
about 7%, which is low, but 7% of 1,800 is still a lot of kids.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the other tensions. I think you can look at a category of a school and say, oh, that's generally this. And on average, we are, but in actual fact, we've got many kids who have special learning needs and have other challenges. So I think one of the things certainly in that model, as the existing model, we have a leader of I think it's called inclusive education in the school, but that's basically overseeing that, and we have quite a significant team of people who work in that area. Something that we need to build on further, but that's part of the school climate sort of group that will be led out by that senior leader. But that person's role is really a critical part of what's going on in the school.
Thank you.
And in fact, we want to have a stronger focus on that than has been necessarily in the case in the past.
Well, there's just so many students that aren't officially identified as well.
Well, that's right.
You're not just looking at the data from that perspective and the funding where that comes from. You're actually talking about students that fall between the cracks and why they aren't performing, and is there a label attached to them to be able to give them that extra support and things like that.
Absolutely, and that's why what we want to develop is a team of people who have a very strong understanding and ownership of that cohort of students, and who provide the services and support that they can, but also then have a clear referral process for students who need something beyond that. Because I think at times in our current system we're dealing with with situations at the moment where, I don't know what you find, but you sort of hit a bit of a roadblock, like you've done what you can here and you're not quite sure what the next step is, and some of the services aren't overly available. And so schools, I suppose what we want to try and do is to provide more of a in-house service, which will need to develop over the next 12 years.
You would hope the faculty leaders drive the differentiation and modification for students that are flagged, those needs anyway within their own faculty.
That's right. What I didn't mention, actually, I should have on that second slide that I put up and then didn't refer to it, was that the school climate people, like the people you're describing, was the AET, the AEW, the inclusive ed person and so on, they were across under the middle school and senior school, because that's where the kids are there. What we see is these are our internal support services, effectively. So these are the groups, the teams that are providing internal support services for the middle school and the senior school, and working with those year level teams and having the kind of student review processes that we need to develop much more strongly in our schools, so we understand the needs of our students more carefully and can better provide specific support and services for them. Some of which will be within the school, and we need that, but we also need, I think, some expertise and some skills that aren't necessarily available normally within a school.
A case management around
Yeah, that's right, exactly.